Special Agent Marcus Blake slammed both palms flat on the interrogation table and leaned in so close that Rowan Jenkins could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You assaulted a United States Navy admiral," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, which made it more dangerous than a shout. "And I am going to make sure the rest of your life reflects exactly what you are: a violent, unstable woman who belongs nowhere near a hospital." Rowan didn't blink. She had just saved a man's life 12 hours ago, and she already knew that nobody in this building was going to believe her. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Rowan's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The hallway outside Trauma Bay 3 at St. Jude's Medical Center had seen everything. Rowan Jenkins had worked that corridor for 11 years, and she had stopped counting the number of times she had run its length at a dead sprint, IV bag in one hand and a chart in the other, screaming at orderlies to clear a path. She had held a man's intestines in her hands once in that exact hallway while a surgeon sprinted from the elevator. She had delivered a baby there on a Tuesday morning when the mother couldn't make it another 10 feet. She had held the hand of a 4-year-old boy who did not survive, and she had stood perfectly still in that hallway afterward and breathed through it because that was the job. You breathed through it and you went back in. So when Admiral William Sterling collapsed in the East Wing corridor at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday in March, Rowan Jenkins did not panic. She assessed. She had just come off a 6-hour shift and was heading toward the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee she had been carrying for 40 minutes. She heard the commotion before she saw it, a sharp intake of breath, the heavy sound of someone's body going rigid, and then 2 male voices barking at each other in low, urgent tones that soldiers used when they didn't want to admit something was wrong. She came around the corner and saw him. Admiral William Sterling was 63 years old, broad-shouldered with silver hair cropped close to his skull and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than bone. He was leaning against the wall with one hand pressed flat against it, and his other hand was pressed against his chest, and the 2 men flanking him, both in civilian clothes, both clearly not civilians, were hovering without touching him, which was the first thing Rowan clocked as wrong. If your boss is leaning against a wall with his hand on his chest, you touch him. You support him. You do not hover 4 inches away like you've been trained not to make contact unless ordered. She stopped walking. Sterling's face was gray, not pale gray, the particular shade of ash that Rowan had learned to recognize the way a painter recognizes a color that never appears in nature except in the most dangerous circumstances. She set her coffee cup on the nearest surface and walked toward him. One of the agents, the taller one with a jaw like a shovel and close-set eyes, stepped sideways to block her path. It was a subtle movement practiced, but Rowan had not spent 11 years in emergency medicine learning to read rooms. She had spent 11 years learning to read bodies, and the body in front of her was not the threat. "Ma'am," the agent said, "please continue to the designated." "I'm a nurse," Rowan said. She did not slow down. "The Admiral is fine," the agent said. "He just needs a moment." Sterling made a sound then. It was not a groan and it was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when his body is doing something his mind has not yet been informed about. And Rowan recognized it the same way she recognized the gray color of his face. She had heard that sound before. She had heard it in the seconds before a cardiac event seized full control. "Sir," she said, stepping around the agent without asking permission, "I need you to tell me where the pain is." Sterling looked at her. His eyes were focused, which surprised her. It was the one thing about him that didn't fit the picture forming in her head. His eyes were sharp and present and embarrassed, which was an emotion she had also learned to recognize. Men of a certain age and a certain authority structure did not like being seen at a disadvantage. It made them say things that got them killed. "It's nothing," Sterling said. His voice was steady. That also surprised her. "Indigestion. I had a heavy lunch." "What did you eat?" He blinked. Nobody had apparently asked him a direct question in a very long time because the blink was genuine surprise. "Excuse me, what did you eat for lunch, sir? I'm asking." "A sandwich." "I don't see what... Are you on any medications?" "I'm not discussing my medical history in a hospital hallway with a nurse," Rowan said. "Yes, that's exactly what you're doing." She reached for his wrist. The tall agent's hand closed around her forearm. Not rough but firm, final, the kind of grip that communicated a boundary that was not going to be negotiated. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed. It was a warning now. "Please step back." Rowan looked at the agent's hand on her arm. Then she looked at Sterling's way, then she looked at the agent again. "If you do not let go of me in the next 3 seconds," she said quietly, "this man is going to code in this hallway, and I am going to make sure every person in this building knows you stopped me from reaching him. That will be on you. Is that what you want?" The agent held on for 2 of those 3 seconds. Then he let go. Rowan reached for Sterling's wrist and found his pulse. It was wrong, not weak wrong, irregular in a way that was specific a pattern she had felt before in patients who were presenting with more than a simple arrhythmia. It stuttered and surged and stuttered again, and Sterling's skin was cool and slightly damp, and his breathing had gone shallow in the way that people breathed when their bodies were quietly, steadily stealing oxygen from their extremities to protect the core. "Sir," she said, and she kept her voice even because panicking was not going to help either of them. "I need you to sit down right now." "I told you it's Admiral Sterling." She said his full title, and she said it directly and without softness, because that was what men like him responded to. "Sit down now." He sat. The agents exchanged a look over his head, and Rowan didn't have time to decode what the look meant, so she filed it away and focused on Sterling. She got him down against the baseboard of the wall and crouched in front of him and started talking him through what she needed speaking in the clipped, precise language that emergency nurses used, because it left no room for misinterpretation. His blood pressure cuff was upstairs in Trauma Bay 3. She needed a gurney. She needed to get him somewhere with monitoring equipment, and she needed to do it in the next 2 minutes. She turned to the shorter agent. "Get me a gurney. There's a supply alcove 20 feet to your left around that corner." "Go." The shorter agent didn't move. "Go," Rowan said again. She said it the way she had learned to say things to people who were frozen by shock or fear or authority, in a voice that contained enough certainty to borrow obedience from people who had none left of their own. The shorter agent went. Sterling made the sound again, worse this time, and his hand, which had been pressing against his chest, went slack. Rowan had one hand on his wrist, and she felt it happen. The pulse went from irregular to absent in the space of a single breath. It was there, and then it wasn't, and the silence in her fingers lasted long enough to confirm what she already knew, and she did not hesitate. She made a fist. It was called a precordial thump. It was not a technique they used routinely anymore. The evidence base had shifted over the years, and the protocols had evolved, and in most modern emergency settings, it was considered a last resort before CPR could begin. But Rowan Jenkins had performed a precordial thump twice before in her career, both times in circumstances where there was no defibrillator available and no time to wait, and both times the patient had come back. She drove her fist into Admiral Sterling's chest with enough force to feel the contact through her knuckle bones. Sterling's body jerked, and then everything went sideways at once. The tall agent was on her before Sterling's next breath, and he was not gentle this time. Both hands on her shoulders, yanking her backward, and she was off balance and down on one knee before she could get her feet under her, and above her, she could hear him shouting something into a radio that had appeared from somewhere, and down the hallway she could already hear other footsteps running, and she had one coherent thought in the middle of all of it. Sterling was breathing. She could see his chest moving. He was breathing. "Get off me," she said. She wasn't shouting. She was far too calm to shout. "He needs CPR monitoring. Get off." "Do not move," the agent said. He had a knee in the small of her back now. "Do not move." "He just went into cardiac arrest. You need to let me." "You just assaulted a United States Navy admiral, and you are going to stay exactly where you are." The footsteps arrived. There were more agents, and then there were hospital security officers, and then there was chaos in the hallway, the way there was always chaos when institutions collided with emergencies and nobody had pre-assigned a chain of command. Rowan stopped fighting the hands holding her down, because fighting was going to make it worse, and she turned her head so she could see Sterling, and she watched a hospital resident she recognized from the cardiac floor, a young man named Torres who was competent and careful, come sprinting around the corner with the crash cart. Torres got to Sterling in 20 seconds. He started assessment in 30. He called for the defibrillator in 45, which meant he had found the same absence of pulse that Rowan had found, which meant she had not imagined it, which meant that what she had done was not an assault. It was medicine. They handcuffed her in the hallway while Torres worked on Sterling 8 feet away. The cuffs were metal and cold, and they clicked into place with a sound that Rowan would hear in her sleep for months afterward. The agent behind her, the tall one, the one who had put a knee in her back, recited something at her that sounded like a rights advisement, but the words weren't landing in the right order because she was watching Torres and watching the monitor that someone had attached to Sterling's chest, and the line on that monitor was moving unsteady and chaotic, but moving, which was better than the alternative. Do you understand these rights as they have been read to you? Rowan pulled her eyes away from Sterling and looked at the agent. Is he stable? Do you understand? Is he stable? The man I just saved? Is he stable? The agent looked at her with the particular expression that people used when they had categorized you and were no longer listening to what you said, only waiting for the moment they could act on the category. You're going to need to come with us, ma'am. They walked her out through the East Wing corridor and through a set of service doors and into a vehicle she did not recognize. And the last thing she saw before the doors closed was Torres looking up from Sterling's body and meeting her eyes across the hallway, and she could not read the expression on his face from that distance. She could only hope that what she saw in it was not the thing she feared. The drive was 37 minutes, she counted. She had nothing else to do in the back of that vehicle with her hands behind her, so she counted the minutes and breathed and went back through every decision she had made in that hallway and could not find the one she would have made differently. She had seen a man dying. She had done what was necessary to keep him alive. The rest of it, the agents, the handcuffs, the crash cart arriving while she was on her knees on the floor, was noise. The job was the job. She was still telling herself that when they brought her into a building that had no markings on the outside and no signage in the lobby, and sat her down in a room with a metal table and 2 chairs and a mirror along one wall that she was not supposed to know was two-way glass. She knew. She had worked in emergency medicine long enough to know what people looked like when they were being watched, and she sat up straight and kept her hands flat on the table and waited. The door opened 22 minutes later. Special Agent Marcus Blake walked in, and he was already talking, and the first thing he said was not a question and not an introduction. It was a statement delivered with the confidence of a man who had already decided the shape of a story and was simply informing her of her role in it. Rowan Jenkins, he said, 11 years at St. Jude's, no disciplinary record, good evaluations, quiet life. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly like a man with all the time in the world. So help me understand what would make a woman with your record walk up to one of the most protected men in the United States military and hit him. Rowan looked at him steadily. I performed a precordial thump on a patient in cardiac arrest. His pulse was absent. The maneuver restored rhythm before your agents could get a crash cart. Blake nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has heard a great many explanations and found all of them insufficient. That's what you're calling it. That's what it was. Our security footage, Blake said, shows a woman approaching Admiral Sterling without authorization, ignoring multiple directives to stand clear and striking him with a closed fist. Your security footage, Rowan said, shows a nurse saving a man's life. Blake leaned forward. The light caught his eyes in a way that told her the angle of that overhead fixture had been chosen deliberately. Everything in a room like this was chosen deliberately. Admiral Sterling, he said, is a very important man. He has a great many friends, and he has a great many enemies. And right now, Ms. Jenkins, the question I need to answer is, which one are you? Rowan kept her hands flat on the table and did not move. And underneath the surface of her composure, something sharp and cold was beginning to take shape. Not fear. Something older and more useful than fear. Because Blake had just made a mistake. He hadn't asked her about her technique. He hadn't asked her about her training. He hadn't asked her a single medical question, which was what any legitimate investigator would have done in the first 60 seconds of an interrogation involving an alleged medical assault. Instead, he had asked her which side she was on. And that was not the question of a man investigating a crime. That was the question of a man protecting something. Rowan looked at Marcus Blake across the metal table and said nothing. And in her silence, for the first time since the handcuffs had clicked into place in that hallway, she stopped being afraid. She started paying attention. Blake let the silence stretch for a full minute after Rowan stopped talking. It was a technique. She recognized it the same way she recognized bad veins and faked unconsciousness. He wanted her to fill the quiet with something he could use. She didn't give it to him. You know what I find interesting, Blake said, finally leaning back in his chair, is that you haven't asked about him. A woman who claims she was trying to save someone's life, the first thing out of her mouth should be, is he okay? But you haven't asked that once since we sat down. Rowan looked at him. I watched Dr. Torres restore his rhythm before your people walked me out of the building. I know he was alive when I left. Whether he's okay now depends on what's wrong with him, and what's wrong with him is not indigestion. Blake's expression didn't change. That was telling. What do you think is wrong with him? He asked. I think that's a question you already have the answer to, Rowan said. And I think the reason we're sitting in an unmarked building instead of a police precinct is because you'd like to keep that answer very quiet. For 2 seconds, Blake was perfectly still. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that people wore when they had been surprised and were deciding whether to respect the source of the surprise or eliminate it. You're smart, he said. I'm a nurse. We have to be. He stood up and walked to the door and knocked twice. Someone on the other side opened it, and Blake stepped halfway out and had a conversation in a voice too low for Rowan to catch anything useful. She used the 30 seconds he was turned away to study the room again. The mirror, the angle of the camera in the upper right corner, the fact that there was no clock anywhere visible, which was standard. You disorient people by removing their sense of time. She pulled up the number in her head, 37 minutes in the vehicle. 22 minutes waiting, approximately 18 minutes of conversation so far. It was close to 5 p.m. The hospital would know she was gone. Someone would have noticed. Blake came back and sat down. He had a folder this time. Let's talk about your background, he said. Let's talk about why Admiral Sterling's security detail didn't want him to receive medical attention, Rowan said. Blake opened the folder as if she hadn't spoken. 11 years at St. Jude's. Before that, 2 years at Mercy General in Baltimore. Before that, nursing school at University of Maryland. Grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Father was a steel worker. Mother was a school secretary. He looked up. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain today. Today doesn't need explaining, Rowan said. Today was medicine. Your colleague, Blake said. Dr. Torres, he's filed an incident report. Would you like to know what it says? She would. She didn't let him see that. He documented that Admiral Sterling presented with an arrhythmic pulse prior to cardiac arrest. Blake said, reading from the folder, consistent with an external physiological trigger rather than a primary cardiac event. He closed the folder. External physiological trigger. That's interesting language for a resident to use. Rowan kept her face still. Torres had seen it too. Whatever had stopped Sterling's heart had not started in Sterling's heart. Torres was 28 years old and careful, and he had written exactly what he observed, which meant that somewhere in St. Jude's medical records, there was documentation that agreed with every instinct Rowan had felt the moment she touched Sterling's wrist. What are you going to do with Torres's report? She asked. That's not your concern. It is if you're planning to make it disappear. Blake set both palms flat on the table, the same gesture he'd used when he walked in, which meant it was a habit under pressure, and habits told you things. Ms. Jenkins, I'm going to give you an opportunity right now to make this significantly easier for yourself. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You reacted instinctively and things escalated in ways you didn't anticipate. If you're willing to characterize the incident that way, as a mistake made in good faith, I can make sure the district attorney understands the context. You want me to say I made a mistake? I want you to consider your future. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. Admiral Sterling was poisoned, she said. The air in the room changed. It was subtle. Blake's breathing shifted, his shoulders dropped a quarter inch, and his jaw tightened in a way that was almost invisible. But Rowan Jenkins had spent 11 years reading bodies, and bodies did not lie the way faces did. He had just confirmed something he had not intended to confirm. That's a serious allegation that he said. It's a serious observation. His pulse pattern was not cardiac. It was induced. The arrhythmia had a regularity to it that doesn't occur naturally in a primary event. It cycles. I've only seen that pattern once before in a toxicology case 3 years ago. A patient came in presenting as cardiac arrest, and it turned out he'd been dosed with a paralytic agent that interfered with the SA node. She kept her eyes on Blake's face. Whoever poisoned Admiral Sterling knew exactly how much to use. "You have a remarkable imagination," Blake said. "I have remarkable hands," Rowan said. "And I know what I felt." Blake stood up. "We're going to take a break. Someone will bring you water." "I don't want water. I want to know if he's alive." Blake walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around. "He's alive," he said, and then he left. Rowan sat alone in that room for 4 hours. She knew it was 4 hours because she counted her own pulse 62 beats per minute, slightly elevated but controlled, and she did the arithmetic. Nobody brought water. Nobody came. The overhead light didn't dim or brighten. The mirror stayed a mirror. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she went through everything she knew in the order she knew it, and she built the shape of what was happening, the way she built a clinical picture from fragmentary symptoms. Sterling had collapsed in a corridor he had likely traveled before or for. His security detail had been present, which was standard for a man of his rank. But the detail had not wanted her to reach him, not because they were following protocol, but because something about her reaching him was specifically a problem. A security detail trained to prevent threats responded to a nurse the way you responded to a threat. That was wrong, unless the threat was not what she might do to Sterling, but what she might find. Torres's report used the phrase external physiological trigger. External, not internal. Something that came from outside Sterling's body had stopped his heart. And Blake had just spent the better part of an hour trying to convince her to call it a mistake and walk away from exactly that question. She was not going to walk away. The door opened. It was not Blake. The man who walked in was older, with the kind of face that had been left out in weather for a long time and had come to terms with it. He wore a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who had spent most of their careers in clothes that weren't suits and had never entirely adjusted. He sat down across from her, set a cup of coffee on the table. Real coffee, she could smell it, and looked at her the way people looked at someone they were genuinely trying to understand. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, "my name is Director Holt. I oversee this division." Rowan looked at the coffee and then at him. She did not touch it. "What division is that?" she asked. "The one that's been watching Admiral Sterling for the past 6 months, Holt said. He said it without preamble, the way a man said something when he had decided honesty was the faster route. Not because he's a suspect, because he's a target. Rowan's hand stayed flat on the table. A target for what? He's been compiling a record, evidence of financial misconduct inside a classified defense program called Trident. The program was designed to modernize naval logistics infrastructure. What it became is something considerably less legal. Holt folded his hands. Sterling was scheduled to deliver documentation to the Senate Armed Services Committee in 4 days. That meeting is no longer going to happen the way it was planned. Because someone tried to kill him, Rowan said. Because someone almost succeeded. The word almost landed between them like a weight being set down. The paralytic compound used, Holt said, and he said it without hesitation, which confirmed that he had already known what she had told Blake, is not something you acquire at a pharmacy. It requires manufacturing capability, and it requires someone with enough knowledge of cardiac pharmacology to calibrate a dose that disables rather than kills outright. Killing Sterling at this point would raise too many questions. Disabling him, creating confusion about his mental state, introducing doubt about the reliability of his testimony, that's more useful. Rowan stared at him. His daughter mentioned he was confused. She stopped. How do you know that Emily said that? Holt looked at her steadily. Because we've been monitoring communications in and around this facility since the incident. Emily Sterling made contact with your hospital 2 hours ago, trying to reach you. He paused. She's persistent. She's scared, Rowan said. Her father, Holt said quietly, is being held in a secured medical unit under Blake's authority. And Blake is not acting on behalf of this agency. He leaned forward slightly. Blake is acting on behalf of the people who did not want Sterling to deliver that testimony. The room went very quiet. Rowan felt the architecture of the past several hours reorganize itself in her mind. Blake's questions about which side she was on, his complete lack of interest in the medical details, his offer to call it a mistake and let her walk away. He hadn't been investigating her. He had been trying to determine whether she knew what she knew and whether he needed to do something about it. He works for you, she said. He works for a defense contractor that employs several people who technically also work for agencies like mine, Holt said. That's a structural problem in my industry. It's one of the things Sterling was going to testify about. He picked up the coffee cup that Rowan hadn't touched and drank from it himself, which was either a message or a habit. You are the only civilian who had direct physical contact with Sterling in the minutes following the poisoning. Your hands were on his wrist. You felt what you felt, and you were trained enough to understand what it meant. I told Blake, Rowan said. I know. Blake filed a report 40 minutes ago stating that you made unsupported allegations consistent with the behavior of an unstable individual attempting to deflect from assault charges. Holt set down the cup. That report has already been forwarded to the nursing board and to 3 journalists who cover national security stories from a perspective that is friendly to the Trident program. Rowan heard that land and breathed through it. Her license, her career, 11 years of work. They were going to use her own words, the truth, as the instrument of her professional destruction. What do you want from me? She asked. I want your official statement, dated, time-stamped, witnessed. Exactly what you felt when you took Sterling's pulse. Exactly the pattern you described. I want it on a record before Blake can complete the narrative he's building. Holt met her eyes. And I need it tonight. And if I give you that statement, Rowan said carefully, what happens to me? I can't promise you it'll be easy. Blake has resources and he has people in the right positions, and he's had 12 more hours to work this than I have. But if your statement is on record and corroborated by Torres's incident report, then the medical evidence of poisoning exists independently of Sterling's testimony. They can't erase both of you. Can't or won't? Holt was quiet for a moment. That distinction matters to you. It determines how afraid I should be. He looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite pity and landed somewhere in between them. You should be moderately afraid, he said. Anyone who isn't moderately afraid in your situation lacks the imagination to understand it fully. He stood. But you're sitting here with your hands flat on a table in a room with no clock, and you've been here 4 hours and you haven't asked for a lawyer, or cried, or told me you just want to go home. So I don't think fear is the thing that's going to decide what you do next. He slid a yellow legal pad across the table and set a pen on top of it. Rowan looked at the pad. Then she looked at the mirror on the wall. She had no way of knowing if Blake was on the other side of it right now. She had no way of knowing if Holt was exactly what he said he was, or another layer of the same mechanism that had put her in handcuffs in the first place. She had no way of knowing if writing down what she knew on a piece of paper would protect her, or simply put the precise shape of her knowledge into the hands of people who needed to understand how much she had to lose. What she knew was what she had felt. Sterling's pulse under her fingers, the cycling arrhythmia that did not belong in a primary cardiac event, the gray color of his face, and the specific quality of his stillness in those last seconds before she made a fist and drove it into his chest. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date at the top of the page, the time, her full name and her nursing license number and her years of experience. And then she started writing exactly what she had felt in the precise clinical language she had spent 11 years developing, and she did not soften it, and she did not qualify it, and she did not look up at the mirror on the wall. She was still writing when the door opened again. It was not Holt. It was Blake, and he was not alone. There were 2 men behind him, and they were not men she had seen before, and the expression on Blake's face was the expression of a man who had just found out something he had been hoping not to find out. He looked at the legal pad in front of her. He looked at the pen in her hand. His jaw tightened. That statement, he said, is not going to leave this room. Rowan set the pen down. She looked at him. I know, she said, and she pulled the page from the pad and folded it once and held it in both hands because it was the only thing she had, and she was not going to let go of it without a reason that was better than the look on Marcus Blake's face. Give me the paper, Ms. Jenkins. Where is Admiral Sterling? She asked. Give me the paper. Where is he? Blake took a step forward, and from somewhere behind him in the corridor outside the open door, Rowan heard a voice she did not recognize. Young female sharp say, Director Holt, I need you to hear this. Right now, please. Blake stopped. And the night, which had already been longer than any night Rowan Jenkins had worked in 11 years at St. Jude's, was nowhere near finished. The voice in the corridor belonged to a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 30 hours and had stopped caring about that fact somewhere around hour 20. She was in her late 20s, dark-haired, wearing a visitor's lanyard from St. Jude's Medical Center that she had clearly not surrendered when she left the building. She was holding a phone in one hand and a manila envelope in the other, and she walked past Blake like he was furniture. Emily Sterling went straight to Director Holt. "They moved him," she said. She was not yelling, she was doing something more controlled than yelling, which was speaking at the precise volume and speed of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be talked out of it. 2 hours ago, they told me he was being transferred to a cardiac care unit for observation. I went to that unit. He's not there. He's not anywhere in the hospital system. I've called 3 numbers I was given, and none of them are working, and I need you to tell me right now where my father is." Holt looked at Blake. The look lasted about 1 second and contained an entire conversation. Blake said, "Miss Sterling, your father is receiving appropriate—" "Don't," Emily said. The word came out like a door closing. "Don't use that voice on me. I've been hearing that voice since yesterday afternoon, and it stops working after the first 12 hours. Where is he?" Rowan was still holding the folded paper. She was watching Blake's face, and Blake's face was doing something complicated. He was calculating. She could see it the same way she could see calculation in a patient who was deciding whether to admit how much they'd had to drink before the car accident. He was weighing options. He was figuring out which version of control he still had left. "Miss Sterling," Blake said, and his voice had shifted into something smoother. "Your father's location is classified for his own protection. Given what happened at the hospital, we have reason to believe—" "Classified," Emily repeated. She said it the way you repeated a word that had just been used in a context that revealed its own absurdity. "His location is classified from his daughter. From everyone without the appropriate clearance, including you." Emily looked at Holt. "Is that legal?" Holt said. "It depends significantly on which authority he's invoking and whether that authority has been legitimately delegated." He said it in the measured tone of a man who was answering the question he had actually been asked rather than the one that was most convenient. "Marcus, which statute are you using?" Blake didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. "He's using 12,333, Emily said. She opened the manila envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Executive Order 12,333, Section 2.3, which permits operational security restrictions on individuals involved in active intelligence matters." I looked it up. She set the paper on the table in front of Holt. "The problem is that 12333 requires a documented threat assessment filed within 6 hours of the restriction being applied. I submitted a FOIA request 40 minutes ago." She paused. "There is no filed assessment because he didn't file one, because he doesn't have the authority to invoke 12333 independently. He needs a deputy director's signature." The room was very quiet. Rowan looked at Blake. Blake was looking at Emily Sterling with an expression that had moved past calculation and arrived somewhere colder. "You're a first-year law student," he said. "Second year," Emily said, "and my father taught me to read primary sources before I was 10 years old." She finally looked at Rowan. "Are you okay?" The question landed so simply that Rowan had to take a breath before she answered it. "I'm okay," she said. "Your father was alive when I left the hospital." "I know," Emily said. "I saw the footage. I saw what you did." Her voice changed slightly on that last sentence, not softer but more careful, the way people got careful when they were holding something fragile. "Thank you," Blake said. "This conversation is over. Miss Sterling, you need to Sir, said one of the 2 men behind Blake, the one on the left. He had been standing still since he walked in, and the fact that he spoke now made everyone in the room look at him because silent men who spoke suddenly in rooms like this were almost always saying something that mattered. "Deputy Director Caswell is online too." Blake went still. Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted the way a current shifted under a surface that looked calm. "Which line too?" Blake asked. "The secure line. In the communications room." The agent paused. "She wants to speak with you directly, sir. She said to tell you she's already read Torres' incident report." The name Torres hit Rowan like a small jolt of electricity. Torres had filed his report. His report had used the phrase external physiological trigger, And now Deputy Director Caswell, whoever she was, whatever her authority was, had read it and was calling Blake directly. Blake looked at the folded paper in Rowan's hands. Then he looked at Emily. Then he looked at Holt with an expression that was, for the first time since Rowan had been in his presence, something other than controlled. "Don't go anywhere," he said. He said it to the room without specifying who he meant, and then he walked out. The moment the door closed, Holt looked at Emily. "How did you get the FOIA request processed in 40 minutes? "I didn't," Emily said. "I sent an email to a professor of mine who clerked for a federal judge. She sent it. Her name carries more weight than mine does." She looked at Rowan. "The envelope he took out of that folder earlier, the one with your background information. Did he show you your own record?" Rowan nodded. "My employment history. Nothing unexpected." "He did the same thing to 3 other witnesses in the past 18 months, Emily said. 2 of them were defense contractors who were going to testify about Trident procurement fraud. The third was a naval logistics officer named Commander Yates." She paused. "Yates withdrew his testimony 2 weeks before the hearing. He cited personal reasons." She let that sit for a moment. "I don't think they were personal." Holt said, "Emily, how long have you been building this file?" "Since February," Emily said. "My father knew he was being watched. He told me 6 weeks ago that if anything happened to him, the first person I should call wasn't law enforcement. It was a specific name, doctor. Patricia Chen, toxicology, George Washington University Hospital." She looked at Rowan. "Do you know her?" "I know of her," Rowan said. "She consulted on a poisoning case at St. Jude's 3 years ago. The paralytic case. The one I told Blake about." Emily nodded slowly. "My father knew about that case. He referenced it specifically. He said if anyone ever needed to understand what happened to him, Patricia Chen would know how to find the evidence." She reached into the envelope again and pulled out a business card. "I called her an hour ago. She's waiting." Rowan stared at the business card. "Your father planned for this." "My father has been planning for this since January," Emily said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not steadiness. It was the opposite of steadiness, being held in place by force of will. "He's been compiling the Trident documentation for 8 months. He knew that the people who ran the program would eventually figure out what he was doing. He knew they would try to stop him. He just..." She stopped, took a breath. "He didn't tell me it would happen this fast." Holt said, "The compound used on your father, do you have any documentation of what it was?" "Dr. Chen thinks it was a derivative of vecuronium, modified to delay onset so it could be administered before he reached the hospital, giving the appearance of a spontaneous cardiac event." Emily looked at Rowan, which it almost was. "If you hadn't been there..." "I was there," Rowan said. She said it simply without drama because the alternative to saying it simply was to think too hard about the margins involved, about the 40-minute-old cup of coffee that had slowed her pace through the corridor at exactly the right moment, about all the ordinary accidents of time and direction that had put her 6 steps away from a man dying in a hallway. "I was there and it's done. Where is your father now?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," Emily said. The door opened again. Not Blake. One of the other agents, not the one who had spoken. The other one, the one who had stayed silent throughout, leaned in and looked at Holt. "Sir Blake has been on the secure line for 11 minutes. Caswell's office says the call was scheduled for 5 minutes. Holt stood up. He had the quality of stillness and motion that senior people in authority sometimes had, where their actions looked unhurried even when they were urgent. "I need the 2 of you to stay in this room," he said. He looked at Rowan. "That statement needs to be finished." "It is finished," Rowan said. She held up the folded page. "I finished it before Blake came back in." Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he held out his hand. She gave him the page. He looked at it, not reading it, just confirming it existed in his hand, and then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and walked out. The door didn't close all the way. Emily looked at Rowan across the table. Up close, she had her father's eyes, the same focused quality, the same alertness that had surprised Rowan in the corridor at St. Jude's. She was scared. She was managing it exactly the way her father had managed it, which said something about what it had been like to grow up in that household. "What was it like?" Emily asked. "When you reached him?" Rowan thought about how to answer that. "He was still fighting it," she said. Whatever was in his system, he was still fighting. His eyes were focused. He was embarrassed about being seen that way. He argued with me. She paused. He told me it was indigestion. Something moved across Emily's face. That sounds like him. He's stubborn. He's the most stubborn man alive. Emily's voice broke slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and got it back. He has to stay that way. He has to stay stubborn long enough for this to... She stopped. From somewhere beyond the not quite closed door, they heard Blake's voice. He was not shouting. He was doing the thing Rowan recognized from earlier speaking, at the level of quiet that was more dangerous than shouting, and even through a half-open door, the quality of it came through clearly enough to understand that the phone call with Deputy Director Caswell had not gone the way he wanted. The nurse is a variable, Blake was saying. She's not a no. No, I understand that. But Torres's report is already in the system, and if Chen gets involved, he stopped, listening. That's not my call to make at this point. If Holt has already, he stopped again. Longer this time. Yes, sir. Understood. Rowan and Emily looked at each other. Sir, Emily said quietly. She said it to herself, noting the same thing Rowan had noted. He's not talking to Caswell anymore, Rowan said. No, Emily agreed. He's not. Whoever Blake was talking to, it was not a deputy director. The shift in his posture visible through the gap in the door, in the form of how his shoulders had changed, how his weight had redistributed toward the wall, told Rowan that he had moved from a call where he had some leverage to a call where he had none. He was receiving instructions now, not negotiating. The call ended. Blake stood in the corridor for 3 seconds without moving. Then he turned and came back through the door, and the first thing he did when he entered the room was look at the table in front of Rowan. He was looking for the legal pad, for the folded page. His face told her exactly when he registered that it was gone. Where is your statement? He said. Director Holt took it, Rowan said. Holt doesn't have the authority to... Oh, he stopped himself. Started again. When did Holt take it? When you were on the phone. Blake pulled out his own phone and made a call that was answered in under 2 seconds, which meant the person on the other end had been waiting for it. He said 3 words, Holt has it, and listened for 5 seconds and ended the call. Then he looked at Emily. Your father, he said, is in a secure medical facility affiliated with Naval Station Anacostia. He is receiving treatment for cardiac complications. He is not well enough for visitors. Emily said, I want that in writing. That's not... I want his location in writing signed by you with a case file number. If you don't give me that in the next 10 minutes, the email my professor is holding, the one addressed to the Senate Armed Services Committee, with a summary of everything I've described to Director Holt tonight goes out. She held up her phone. She's waiting for my call. Blake stared at her. You're bluffing. My father spent 26 years in the United States Navy, Emily said. He taught me that you only threaten what you are prepared to execute. Call it. 10 seconds of silence. Blake sat down. He pulled a notepad from his jacket, not a legal pad, a small leather-covered one, and wrote something on it and tore the page out and slid it across the table to Emily. She read it. She took a photo of it with her phone before she picked it up. Naval Station Anacostia, she said. Building 7, Medical Annex. That's what I wrote, Blake said. Emily looked at Rowan. Can you walk? I've been sitting in a chair for 4 hours, Rowan said. I can run. We're not running, Emily said. She stood up and straightened her jacket and picked up her envelope. We're driving, calmly, in my car, which is outside this building because I followed the vehicle they used to bring you here. She looked at Blake. We're leaving now. Blake said, you can't remove her from... She was brought here without being charged, Emily said. She was not arrested. She was not Mirandized. Director Holt told her she could leave and she is leaving. She looked at Rowan. He did tell you that, didn't he? Rowan thought about Holt's exact words. She hadn't been told she could leave. She had been told to stay in the room. But the paper was gone, the statement was on record, and the man who had been using her as a piece in a game he controlled was standing across a table from her with his jaw tight and his phone in his pocket and no remaining move that didn't cost him something significant. He implied it, Rowan said. She stood up. Blake said Jenkins. He used her last name the way people use last names when they were out of softer options. If you walk out of here tonight, I cannot protect you from what comes next. Rowan stopped. She turned around and looked at him one last time, at the folder on the table, at the mirror on the wall, at the room with no clock that had held her for 4 hours while men she didn't know decided what her truth was worth. She looked at Blake and she felt something settle in her chest that was not anger and was not courage and was not the particular steadiness of shock. It was clarity, the same clarity she felt in the seconds before a code when everything fell away except what needed to happen next. "It, Blake," she said. "I am a nurse. People have been telling me what I can't do in emergency situations for 11 years. It doesn't change what needs to happen." She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "You have a good night." She walked out. Emily was 3 steps ahead of her in the corridor, already on her phone, already talking to someone in a low, urgent voice. Rowan followed her through a door and down a stairwell and out into air that was cold and sharp after hours of recycled indoor nothing, and she breathed it and kept walking. The car was a dark blue sedan, parked at the edge of the lot at an angle that suggested it had been left in a hurry. Emily unlocked it without breaking stride, and they both got in, and Emily started the engine and pulled out before Rowan had fully closed her door. "Building 7 Medical Annex," Emily said. 20 minutes from here." She glanced at Rowan. "Dr. Chen is meeting us there." "Does she know what she's looking for?" Rowan asked. "She knows what my father described to me. She knows the compound. She knows the dosage pattern." Emily merged onto a main road and accelerated. "What she doesn't know yet is that there's a nurse who felt his pulse in the minutes following administration." She glanced over. "Your hands are evidence, Ms. Jenkins. Your clinical observation is evidence. Blake knows that. Blake knows. That's why he wanted your statement to disappear." Rowan looked at her own hands in her lap, the same hands that had pressed against Sterling's wrist in that corridor, the same hands that had made a fist and saved a man's life and set everything that followed in motion. "Will your father remember me?" she asked. Emily was quiet for a moment. "He remembers everything," she said. "Even now, even through the confusion they're claiming he has." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "That's the thing about the compound they used. It doesn't touch the mind. It just makes the body look like it does." Her voice dropped. "He knows exactly where he is. He knows exactly what happened, and he cannot tell anyone because the people watching him have decided that he's too impaired to be a credible witness." Rowan felt the weight of that land fully. Sterling awake, aware, trapped inside a medical profile that had been designed to discredit him before he could speak. His own testimony locked behind a diagnosis that didn't belong to him. "Then we have to get to him," Rowan said. "Mark, that's exactly what we're going to do," Emily said. The city moved past them in the dark, and neither of them spoke again for the next several miles. There was nothing left to say. The plan had already been decided by the sequence of events, by a cup of lukewarm coffee carried 40 minutes too long, by a man leaning against a wall, with his hand on his chest, by the particular irregular cycling of a pulse under a nurse's fingers in a hospital hallway. Everything that came next had already been set in motion. Dr. Patricia Chen was already at the gate when Emily pulled in. She was small and precise-looking, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a messenger bag over one shoulder that was clearly too heavy for a social visit. She did not wave. She walked directly to the car as it stopped and got in the back seat without being invited. The way people got in cars when standing outside was a liability. "You're Jenkins," she said to Rowan, not as a question. "I am." "Emily told me what you felt, the cycling pattern." Chen pulled a tablet from her bag and angled it so Rowan could see the screen without turning fully around. "I want you to look at this and tell me if this matches what you described to Blake." On the screen was a cardiac monitor readout, a waveform. Rowan looked at it for 4 seconds. "That's it," she said. "That's the exact pattern." Chen nodded once. "This is from a case study published in 2019. A modified vecuronium derivative delayed onset formulation administered orally with high-acid food or drink to accelerate absorption through the gastric lining. Onset 12 to 20 minutes post-ingestion. Primary effect is selective depression of the sinoatrial node, producing a cycling arrhythmia that mimics primary cardiac dysfunction. She looked at Rowan over the top of her glasses. "The lunch. Did he mention what he ate?" "A sandwich," Rowan said. "He said it himself." "High-acid condiments, vinegar-based most likely. It would have accelerated the timeline." Chen closed the tablet. Whoever administered this knew his lunch, knew his schedule, and knew enough cardiac pharmacology to calculate a dose that would disable rather than kill. She looked at Emily. This was not improvised. Emily's hands were still on the steering wheel. She hadn't turned the engine off. How do we prove it? He's inside that building, and we don't have access. We don't need access to the building, Chen said. We need access to his blood work. The compound has a metabolic half-life of approximately 36 hours. It's been, she charted her watch, approximately 22 hours since the incident. There is still a measurable quantity in his system. Any blood draw taken in the last 4 hours would show it if someone ran the right panel. They won't run the right panel, Rowan said, because running the right panel confirms the poisoning. Blake controls what tests are ordered. Blake controls what tests are ordered in that facility, Chen said. She paused deliberately. He does not control what I ordered at George Washington University Hospital at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Both Rowan and Emily turned to look at her. Chen reached back into her bag and produced a single printed sheet. I have a contact at Anacostia, a corpsman named Whitfield, who cross-trained in toxicology and did his clinical rotation under me 4 years ago. He called me at 2:30 this afternoon, approximately 90 minutes after the Admiral was transferred to that facility because something in the preliminary blood work he ran looked wrong and he didn't know what to do with it. She held out the sheet. He pulled a sample for me. I had my lab run a preliminary tox screen. The results came back 40 minutes ago. Emily took the sheet. She read it. She handed it to Rowan. Rowan read it carefully the way she read lab results, not skimming, not jumping to the flag values, but reading the whole picture the way a clinical document demanded. She got to the bottom. She read the flag values. She read the notation at the bottom of the page where Chen's lab technician had written 3 words in capital letters with a question mark, modified neuromuscular blocker suspected. This is the proof, Rowan said. This is preliminary evidence, Chen corrected. To make it evidence that holds up, I need a formal chain of custody on the sample, a confirmatory panel run by a certified forensic toxicology lab, and a physician's statement connecting the compound to the clinical presentation. She looked at Rowan again. Your clinical observation documented and time-stamped. Torres's incident report. My lab results. Together, they form a complete picture. Blake already has my statement, Rowan said. Holt took it. Then it's on record somewhere, Chen said. Even if Blake tries to bury it, the document exists. Records that exist can be found. Emily was already on her phone. She held up one finger, a single gesture that asked for 30 seconds and spoke in a rapid, low voice to whoever had answered. Rowan caught fragments. The tox results are back. Yes, I need you to file it with the committee clerk tonight, not tomorrow tonight. I don't care what time it is. She ended the call. My professor, she said. She's filing a formal notification to the Senate Armed Services Committee within the hour. Not the full documentation, just a notice that evidence related to Admiral Sterling's testimony exists and is being actively suppressed. She looked at Chen. Can you have the confirmatory panel run tonight? I already submitted the request, Chen said. Results by 6 in the morning. Rowan looked at the sheet in her hands and felt the structure of what they were building: statement, incident report, chain of custody, tox confirmation, Senate notification, and understood for the first time since the handcuffs clicked into place in that hallway that the shape of the truth was larger than Marcus Blake's ability to contain it. Not because any single piece was enough, but because all of them together, distributed across enough separate hands and separate institutions, could not be erased by one man making phone calls from a corridor. I need to get inside that building, Emily said. She said it quietly, not as a plan, but as the thing underneath all the other things she had been doing for the past several hours. I need to see him. Chen said, the corpsman Whitfield. He's still on shift until 0600. Emily looked at her. Would he let me in? He already let me pull evidence that he was not authorized to share with a civilian researcher. I think the question of what he'd let you do depends significantly on how you ask him and what you're willing to tell him about why. Chen met Emily's eyes steadily. He's a young man with a conscience who found something he didn't expect and called his mentor instead of his supervisor. That tells you who he is. I need 5 minutes with my father, Emily said. That's all. 5 minutes. Rowan said, if they have him documented as cognitively impaired, anything he says tonight could be challenged on those grounds. Even if you get in, even if he talks to you, they'll say the compound affected his cognition and his statements aren't reliable. I know, Emily said. I don't need him to say anything. I need him to see me, and I need to see him. She stopped. She pressed her lips together in that same gesture of controlled emotion Rowan had seen in the interrogation room. He's been in there alone for 22 hours. He knows what happened to him. He knows they're using the poisoning to make him look impaired. He's been awake this whole time, fully aware, unable to speak without it being used against him. Her voice stayed even, but her knuckles on the steering wheel went white. I'm not going in there to get evidence. I'm going in there because he is my father, and he has been alone for 22 hours, and that is not acceptable to me. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Rowan said, I'll go with you. Emily looked at her. You don't have to. I have clinical authority to assess a patient's neurological and cardiac status in a post-event context, Rowan said. If Whitfield is letting people in, he's more likely to let in a nurse with a documented history of treating the patient than just a family member alone. She paused. Also, if your father is as aware as you believe he is, he deserves to see the face of the person who kept him alive. That's not evidence. That's just right. Emily held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then she nodded. She picked up her phone and dialed. Whitfield answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, and Rowan could only hear Emily's side of it, but she tracked it through Emily's expressions the moment Whitfield hesitated, the moment Emily said something that moved past the hesitation, the moment his resistance shifted into reluctant agreement. When Emily ended the call, her face was not relieved. It was focused in the way faces got when you had secured the next step and were already calculating the one after it. 10 minutes, Emily said. He'll meet us at the service entrance on the north side. We have a 20-minute window before the shift supervisor does rounds. Chen said, I'll wait here. If you're not back in 25 minutes, I'm calling the only person left on my contact list whose name makes Marcus Blake nervous. Who's that? Rowan asked. Chen smiled for the first time since she'd gotten in the car. The woman who trained him, she said. She doesn't like him very much. Whitfield was exactly what Chen's description had suggested. Young, careful, visibly uncomfortable, and clearly someone who had decided that doing the right thing was worth the cost before he fully understood what the cost might be. He led them through a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and fluorescent lighting, and said nothing beyond the essential navigational instructions until they reached a door at the end of a secondary hallway. He's in there, Whitfield said. They've got a monitor on him and a standing order for sedation if his vitals fluctuate. I can't disable the monitor, but I can make sure nobody checks the readout for the next 18 minutes. He looked at Rowan. His cardiac rhythm has been stable for the last 6 hours. Whatever the compound is doing, it's clearing. That matches the half-life, Rowan said. Is he verbal? He's been verbal since this afternoon, Whitfield said. The attending documented him as confused and non-responsive. He paused. I was in the room when the attending examined him. He wasn't confused. He answered every question accurately and completely. The attending wrote something different than what happened. Rowan and Emily looked at each other. That's falsification of medical records, Rowan said. Yes, Whitfield said. He said it like a man who had been sitting with that knowledge for hours and had not yet found a place to put it. I know what it is. Emily put her hand on the door. 18 minutes, she said. She pushed it open. Admiral William Sterling was sitting up. Not lying down, not propped up with pillows in the managed posture of a managed patient. Sitting up with his back straight and his hands in his lap and his eyes on the door before it was fully open because he had heard the footsteps and was waiting. He looked thinner than he had in the corridor at St. Jude's. He looked like someone who had been through something that had taken a physical toll, and he looked like someone who was refusing to let that toll define the expression on his face. His eyes found Emily first. He said her name. Just her name. Nothing else, and the way he said it contained everything that 22 hours of isolation and silence and deliberate medical misrepresentation had accumulated, and it was not a sound that required any clinical interpretation. Emily crossed the room in 4 steps and sat on the edge of the bed and took both his hands in hers and did not say anything for a moment and Sterling held on with the grip of a man who had been waiting a very long time to hold on to something real. Then he looked at Rowan. He studied her face with those sharp, present eyes that had surprised her in the corridor. He looked at her the way he had looked at her then, with the specific alertness of a man whose mind was working correctly regardless of what anyone had written in his chart. "You're the nurse," he said. "Rowan Jenkins," she said. "Yes, sir." "They told me you assaulted me," he said. There was no anger in it. It was a statement of what he had been told, delivered in a tone that made clear what he thought of it. "They showed me the security footage," he continued. "Yesterday evening, one of Blake's people brought a tablet in here and showed me the clip and told me I should sign a statement confirming that I felt threatened." He paused. "I told him where he could put the tablet." Emily made a sound that was almost a laugh and did not become one. "You knew what I was doing," Rowan said. "I knew someone was doing something," Sterling said. "I didn't know who you were or what your training was, but I knew I was going out, and then I knew I didn't go out. And the first person I saw when I came back was you on your knees on that floor with two of my security detail pulling you away." He looked at her steadily. "I signed nothing. I will sign nothing. And when I am out of this room, the first thing I am going to do is make sure every person in the chain of command above Marcus Blake understands exactly what happened in that corridor." "Sir," Rowan said carefully, "the compound they used, it's still in your system. Partially. The attending physician has documented you as cognitively impaired. Anything you say tonight can be—" "I know," Sterling said, his jaw tightened. "I know what they're doing. I've known since I woke up in this room and found an attending physician asking me questions in the voice people use when they want you to give wrong answers." He looked at his daughter. "Emily, the documentation." "The committee clerk is receiving notice within the hour," Emily said. "Chen has the tox results. Jenkins's statement is on record with Holt." "Holt," Sterling said. He considered the name. "Holt I can work with. Holt has been uncomfortable about Blake's role in this operation for 6 months. I know because he sent me a message in February through a back channel that contained exactly one sentence." He looked at Rowan. "It said, 'Be careful who hands you food.'" Rowan felt the chill of that settle into her. He knew. He suspected, Sterling said, and he didn't have enough to act on it without exposing his own operation. But he's been waiting for something to break the situation open. He looked at Emily. "Does he have my daughter's FOIA submission?" "Yes." "Good. That's his justification for moving against Blake through official channels. He needed a legal trigger that he didn't generate himself." Sterling almost smiled. 26 years of naval intelligence, and I still find it remarkable how often the right person appears at the right hallway at exactly the right moment. He looked at Rowan again. "How much time do we have?" 14 minutes, Rowan said. "Then let me tell you what is in the Trident documentation," Sterling said, "because you need to understand what you are part of. Not because I want to put that on you, but because people who carry something without knowing its weight drop it when things get difficult, and things are going to get significantly more difficult before they get resolved." He sat up straighter. His voice shifted into something that was not informal and not performative. It was the register of a man delivering the information that mattered in the time available to deliver it. "Trident was authorized in 2019 as a naval logistics modernization program," he said. "Over 4 years, approximately $2.3 billion passed through its procurement structure. Of that, I have documented evidence that $640 million was directed to contractors who did not perform the contracted work. The contractors are shell companies. The shell companies trace back to 3 individuals, 2 of whom currently hold senior positions in the Department of Defense." He paused. "The third is a sitting United States Senator." The room was very quiet. "The senator," Sterling continued, "sits on the Armed Services Committee, the committee I was scheduled to testify before in 4 days." He let that land fully before continuing. "Blake works for a lobbying group that was retained by the senator's office 18 months ago. His job was not to investigate threats to national security. His job was to identify and neutralize sources of testimony." Rowan said, "Neutralize." "Commander Yates withdrew his testimony," Sterling said. "He withdrew it because Blake presented him with evidence of a personal matter that Yates could not afford to have made public." The two defense contractors before him, one had a tax issue that materialized suddenly and required all his attention. The other moved to take care of an elderly parent in another country. He looked at his hands for a moment. Blake is very good at finding the right kind of pressure for each person. He looked up at Rowan. He had nothing on you. You appeared without warning, and you couldn't be pressured in the usual ways because you hadn't done anything wrong. So he tried to make you the story, an unstable nurse who attacked a senior military officer. His voice was measured and cold. He needed to make that story real before the medical evidence contradicted it. He almost succeeded, Rowan said. He hasn't succeeded, Sterling said. And he won't because the documentation I have been compiling for 8 months is not on any government server and not in any location that Blake's people have access to. He looked at Emily. Tell her. Emily reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small flash drive. It was ordinary looking, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. She held it up. He gave me this in January, she said. He told me if anything happened to him, I should give it to the one person he trusted to know what to do with it. She looked at Rowan. He told me that person would make themselves known by doing something that nobody else would do in the same situation. Rowan looked at the flash drive, then at Sterling, then back at Emily. A nurse in a hospital hallway, she said quietly. A nurse in a hospital hallway, Sterling confirmed. He held Rowan's gaze with those sharp, present eyes that had never once in any of this looked like the eyes of a man whose cognition had been compromised. The documentation on that drive names every shell company, every false invoice, every bank transfer, and every individual who authorized them. It is complete. It is verified. And in approximately, he looked at Emily, how long until the committee clerk receives the notification? 40 minutes, Emily said. In approximately 40 minutes, Sterling said, the Armed Services Committee will know that evidence exists relating to my testimony. At that point, suppressing me becomes significantly more complicated than it was an hour ago. He straightened. Ms. Jenkins, I owe you my life. I intend to make sure that debt is honored in every form available to me. But right now, I need you to do one more thing. What's that? Rowan asked. I need you to write a second statement, he said. Not about my pulse in the corridor, about what you see in front of you right now. A clinical observation, my cognitive status, my responsiveness, my comprehension. What you observe as a nurse with 11 years of emergency medicine experience looking at a patient who has been documented as non-responsive and confused. He held her gaze. Write what you see. Rowan looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at every patient, fully, completely without the filter of what she had been told to expect. She looked at his posture and his eyes and the quality of his speech and the coherence of his narrative and the precision of his memory and the sharpness of his decision-making in the past 7 minutes. She pulled the legal pad from her bag that she had taken from the interrogation room without being asked and without being stopped because nobody had been paying attention to what was in her hands when she walked out and she set it on the edge of the bed. She started writing. 11 minutes later, when Whitfield knocked twice on the door, the signal that the window was closing, Rowan had 3/4 of a page in clinical language that left no room for alternative interpretation. She tore it off and folded it and handed it to Emily, who put it with the tox results and the FOIA documentation in the flash drive that contained the financial architecture of one of the largest defense fraud schemes in a decade. Sterling looked at Rowan one last time before she reached the door. Jenkins, he said. She turned. Whatever they tell you tomorrow, he said, about your license, your record, your career, don't let it move you. The truth of what happened is on record now in enough places that they cannot erase it. And I will be in front of that committee, one way or another. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who had survived 26 years of naval intelligence and 1 deliberate poisoning and 22 hours of enforced isolation and was still sitting up straight. You have my word. Rowan Jenkins looked at Admiral William Sterling and believed him. Not because he was an admiral, and not because he said it with authority, but because she had felt his pulse under her fingers at the worst moment of his life, and she knew the quality of what was underneath the surface of him. She nodded once. She walked out. In the corridor, Emily fell into step beside her. Neither of them spoke. The building hummed with the specific quiet of late-night institutional spaces, the kind of quiet that was not peaceful, but suspended as though everything was holding its breath. They were 30 feet from the service exit when Rowan heard footsteps behind them. Fast. More than one person. Emily grabbed her arm. They did not run. Running confirmed guilt. They walked faster, and Rowan counted the steps to the door, and she heard the footsteps close the distance, and she heard a voice say, "Stop. Both of you. Now." She recognized the voice. Marcus Blake had not stayed in the building with the metal table and the two-way mirror. He had followed them here. Rowan stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She took one breath, the kind she took before a code, before a crisis, before the moment when everything depended on what happened in the next 10 seconds. And then she turned. Blake was 15 feet behind them. He was alone, which surprised her. A man like Blake did not usually operate without coverage. The fact that he was alone meant he had moved faster than his support structure and had not waited for backup, which meant something had shifted in his calculation. Something had made him urgent. "You went to see him," Blake said. It was not a question. "My client had a right to see her father," Emily said. She had stepped slightly in front of Rowan without appearing to do it deliberately. "A family member's right to access a hospitalized relative is protected under—" "I don't want to hear about protected rights," Blake said. He was looking at the envelope in Emily's hand, at the folded pages visible through the partially open flap. His jaw was tight in a way that had moved past controlled into something raw. "What did he give you?" "Nothing," Emily said. "Emily." He said her name the way adults said children's names when the pretense of patience had run out. "Your father is a sick man who is not in a condition to make sound decisions. Whatever he told you, whatever he gave you, it is not reliable, and it is not legal for you to remove from this facility. Give me the envelope." "No," Emily said. Blake took a step forward. Rowan moved, not toward Blake, sideways, putting herself level with Emily rather than behind her. She did it without thinking about it, the same way she moved in the ER when she needed to be somewhere because the situation required a body in a specific place. "Agent Blake," she said. Her voice was steady. "The patient in room 7 assessed as fully alert and oriented ×3 when I examined him 18 minutes ago. His responses were coherent. His memory was intact. His reasoning was linear and specific. I have documented that assessment on paper that is now part of this evidence package." She held his gaze. "If you take this envelope by force, you are taking documented medical evidence from a nurse who performed a legitimate clinical assessment. That is tampering. That is a federal offense that does not require a deputy director's signature to prosecute." Blake looked at her. The look lasted long enough to tell her he was recalculating. "You have no idea," he said, "what you have walked into the middle of." "I walked into a hospital hallway," Rowan said. "The rest of it walked into me." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face changed, a rapid, barely visible tightening that started at his eyes and moved downward, the expression of a man reading something he had hoped not to read. He looked up from the phone and he looked at Rowan and then at Emily. And for the first time since Rowan had seen him walk into that interrogation room with his palms flat on the table and his certainty intact, Marcus Blake looked like a man whose plan had developed a crack he could not fill. "The committee notification went out," Emily said. She had checked her own phone in the same moment. 8 minutes ago, the clerk confirmed receipt." She held his gaze. "It's on record, Agent Blake. The evidence exists, and the committee knows it exists. There is no version of tonight where that changes." Blake stood in that corridor for 10 seconds without moving. Rowan counted them. She had gotten very good at counting things in the last 24 hours. She counted his stillness, and she watched his face, and she saw the exact moment when the structure of his position shifted beneath him, the way ground shifted in bad weather. He stepped aside. He did it without a word, which was worse than anything he could have said because it meant he had moved to a different calculation entirely. He was not done. He was repositioning. Men like Blake did not concede, they regrouped. Rowan knew that, and she felt it, and she filed it in the part of her mind that had been quietly tracking threats since the moment the handcuffs clicked in that hallway. She and Emily walked through the service exit and into the cold air and across the lot to where Chen was standing beside Emily's car with her phone to her ear and her other hand in her coat pocket, and an expression that shifted from tense to something less tense when she saw both of them walking. Chen ended her call. The confirmatory panel is running, she said. I pushed for a 6-hour turnaround. Results by 0400. She looked at the envelope in Emily's hand. Did you get to him? We got to him, Emily said. And he's coherent, Rowan said. Completely. I documented it. Chen exhaled. Then we have everything. Tox results, clinical observation, incident, documentation, financial records. She looked between them. What happened with Blake? He let us go, Emily said. Chen frowned. That's not... I know, Emily said. He's not done. No, Chen said. He isn't. She opened the car door. Get in, both of you. There's someone I need to call, and I need to make that call before Blake makes his next move, because his next move is going to be directed at the one piece of this that isn't yet locked down. What piece? Rowan asked. Your nursing license, Chen said. She looked directly at Rowan. He filed a complaint with the state nursing board 2 hours ago. I found out 20 minutes ago from a contact inside the board's administrative office. The complaint alleges professional misconduct, falsification of clinical observations, and deliberate patient endangerment. She paused to let that land. He's trying to remove your clinical standing before your assessment of Sterling can be entered as credible medical testimony. If your license is suspended pending review, your documented observations become the statements of an individual under professional investigation. That's how he degrades the evidence without having to destroy it. Rowan sat in the passenger seat and felt that hit the way physical things hit, not emotionally, not abstractly, but in the body and the chest where 11 years of work lived. Her license, the thing she had built in Baltimore and expanded in Washington and maintained through every difficult patient and every difficult shift and every night she had driven home and questioned whether she had done enough and concluded that she had. That was the target, not her freedom, not her safety in the physical sense. The professional identity that made her clinical word mean anything. How long does a complaint take to process, Emily asked. Standard review is 60 days, Chen said. But Blake filed it with a request for emergency suspension pending review. That can be granted within 24 hours by the board chair. She started the engine. The board chair is a man named Dr. Gerald Marsh. I know Gerald Marsh. I trained under the same senior physician he did 20 years ago. She glanced at Rowan. I'm going to call him, right now, tonight. And I am going to explain to him in precise clinical language exactly what you observed and exactly why your assessment is consistent with established toxicological literature, and I am going to do it before Blake's version of events becomes the only version Gerald Marsh has heard. She pulled out of the lot. But I need you to be prepared for the possibility that it takes longer than tonight to resolve. How much longer? Rowan asked. I don't know, Chen said. I wish I had a better answer. Rowan looked out the window at the city moving past in the dark. She thought about the break room at St. Jude's, the locker with her name on it, the charge nurse, a woman named Margaret, who had been there longer than anyone and who made terrible coffee and kept order in the way people kept order when they genuinely cared about a place. She thought about the East Wing corridor that she had run 1,000 times. She thought about the 40-minute old cup of coffee she had been carrying when she turned to that corner and saw a man leaning against a wall with his hand on his chest. She was not going to lose what she had built because Marcus Blake needed a lever. Make the call, she said. Chen made the call. She made it for 11 minutes while Emily drove, and Rowan listened to one half of a conversation that was precise and technical and carried the full weight of Chen's authority and credential and 20-year professional relationship with Gerald Marsh. When Chen ended the call, she sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. He'll hold the suspension request for review, she said. He's not dismissing the complaint. He's required to process it through normal channels. But the emergency suspension won't be granted tonight. She looked at Rowan. That's what I could get him at midnight. It buys us until the confirmatory tox panel comes back. That's enough, Rowan said, because it was. One thing at a time. That was how you worked a trauma, not the whole picture at once, but the immediate bleeding, the immediate airway, the immediate threat. One thing at a time, and then the next thing, and then the next need. They drove back to Chen's lab at George Washington University in near silence. Emily parked and the three of them went inside, and Chen set the flash drive contents running through her department's secure analysis system, and Emily sent 3 more emails from her phone in the way of someone who had been corresponding with her professor and the committee clerk, and 2 journalists she had apparently contacted, before Rowan had even known she existed, and Rowan sat in a lab chair with her hands around a cup of actual hot coffee that Chen had made from a machine in the corner, and she let herself be still for the first time in 20 hours. She thought about Sterling sitting up in that bed, the way he had said Emily's name, the way his eyes had found Rowan's face and assessed her with complete clarity and no trace of the impairment that had been written into his chart by a physician doing someone else's work. She thought about what he had said, "Don't let it move you." She thought about the flash drive and $640 million of misdirected funds and 2 people with senior Defense Department positions and a senator who sat on the committee meant to provide oversight over the programs he had been quietly looting. She thought about a woman named Rowan Jenkins, who had been carrying a lukewarm coffee down a hospital hallway on a Thursday afternoon and had turned a corner and decided in the space of 4 seconds that a man's life was more important than the instruction to stand clear. At 4:17 in the morning, Chen's printer ran. The confirmatory tox panel results were 12 pages. Chen read them at the speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and where it would appear. She set the pages down and took off her reading glasses and looked at Rowan. "Modified vecuronium derivative," she said. "Delayed onset formulation. Present in the sample at a concentration consistent with intentional administration rather than incidental exposure." She paused. "It's confirmed." Emily, who had been sitting across the room with her head back and her eyes closed in the posture of someone who was not sleeping but had stopped performing, wakefulness opened her eyes. She looked at Chen. She looked at Rowan. She did not say anything. She picked up her phone and sent a message. 20 seconds later, her phone buzzed with a response. "My professor is forwarding the tox results to the committee clerk," Emily said, "with Chen's preliminary findings and the chain of custody documentation from Whitfield." She set the phone down. "It's in their hands." At 6:58 in the morning, Director Holt called Chen's office line. Rowan was the one who answered it because Chen was on another call, and Emily had finally, after 22 hours of not stopping, fallen asleep in the chair across the room with her jacket over her shoulders. "Ms. Jenkins," Holt said. He sounded like a man who had also not slept, but for different reasons than exhaustion. "Blake was placed on administrative leave 40 minutes ago. A formal investigation has been opened into his conduct and his affiliations. The investigation is being led by Deputy Director Caswell directly." He paused. "The Armed Services Committee has requested Admiral Sterling's testimony be rescheduled to a preliminary closed session within 72 hours, pending his medical clearance." Rowan said, "Will he get that clearance?" "Based on your clinical assessment and Dr. Chen's toxicology confirmation." Holt said, "The medical board at Anacostia will be conducting an independent review of his chart documentation this morning. The attending physician who filed the impairment documentation has been removed from his case." He stopped. "I should tell you that I owe you an apology." "For what specifically?" Rowan asked. "For not getting you out of that building sooner," he said. "I needed Blake to believe he was still in control long enough for the committee notification to go out. I used the time you bought me." His voice was direct and not comfortable with itself, which she respected more than if it had been smooth. "That was the right call strategically. It was not a comfortable one." "It worked," Rowan said. "That's what matters." "Your statement is now part of the formal investigation record," Holt said. "Your clinical observations will be submitted to the committee as corroborating medical evidence alongside the tox results. The nursing board has received a formal letter from this office noting that your assessment of Admiral Sterling has been determined to be accurate, competent, and critical to the investigation." He paused. "I don't know if that will be sufficient for Gerald Marsh." "Dr. Chen is handling Gerald Marsh," Rowan said. "Good," Holt said, and then in a different register, quieter, "The sandwich, Ms. Jenkins. The high-acid condiments. Do you want to know how it was administered?" She did. "Tell me." Blake's secondary operative was embedded in the Admiral's logistics staff for 14 months. He had complete access to Sterling's schedule, his dietary preferences, his daily routine. Holt's voice was flat and factual in the way of someone delivering information that disgusted them and had made their peace with it. The compound was introduced into a bottle of salad dressing kept in the Admiral's private refrigerator at his office. He ate at his desk that day, which he did approximately 3 times a week. The timing was calculated to ensure onset would occur during his transit to the hospital for a previously scheduled cardiac checkup, making the location and the appearance of a natural event and simultaneous. He paused. Someone planned this for months, Ms. Jenkins. Someone calculated that a man having a cardiac event in a hospital corridor would be treated as exactly that, a cardiac event. No suspicion, no investigation, no toxicology panel, unless someone with very specific training happened to touch his pulse at exactly the right moment. Rowan was quiet. You were not supposed to be there, Holt said. And because you were, everything they built over 14 months is coming apart. She set down the coffee cup. Will it be enough, the testimony, the documentation, the tox results? Will it actually be enough to bring down a sitting senator? That, Holt said, is no longer a question I can answer. That is a question for prosecutors and committees, and the process of accountability, which is slow and imperfect and deeply frustrating to people who understand what actually happened. He stopped. But the evidence exists. It's on record in enough places and in enough forms that it cannot be made to disappear. Whether the process that follows it is just and complete, that I cannot promise you. What I can promise you is that Admiral Sterling will testify, and the truth of what happened to him and what happened to you will be part of the official record of this country's history. That matters even when the rest of it moves too slowly. I know, Rowan said, because she did. 11 years in emergency medicine had taught her that you did not always get to see the outcome of what you started. You stopped the bleeding and you passed the patient to the next person, and you trusted the chain. The chain was imperfect. The chain sometimes failed. But you held your piece of it as well as you could, and you let it go when the next hands were ready, and you went back to the hallway and you did it again. When Sterling walked into the disciplinary hearing for Rowan's nursing license 3 weeks later, he walked in without a cane and without assistance and without anyone flanking him, and he sat down at the table across from the board with his back straight and his hands folded, and the room became very quiet in the way rooms got quiet when the person who entered them was carrying something that everyone present could feel but not immediately name. Gerald Marsh, the board chair, looked at him for a moment. Then he opened his folder. Sterling did not wait for a question. He said, and I am here because a nurse named Rowan Jenkins made a decision in a hospital corridor that required ignoring the instructions of my security detail, overriding my own stated refusal of care, and performing a physical intervention that looked to any observer without clinical context like an act of violence. He looked at Marsh. That decision kept me alive. I know that with certainty because I was conscious throughout the event, and I know exactly what was happening to my body, and I know exactly what she did and why she did it. He paused. Any professional action taken against Rowan Jenkins on the basis of that decision is an action taken against a nurse who did precisely what the best nurses do, she trusted. What her hands told her over what the room told her, and she acted. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Rowan sat at her own table with Chen beside her and Emily 2 rows behind her, and she answered every question directly and without embellishment and without apology. And she watched Gerald Marsh's face change incrementally as the clinical record was presented. Her statement, Torres's incident report, Chen's tox confirmation, Holt's letter, and finally Sterling's own testimony, and she understood that she was watching a man who had received a complaint prepared by someone with an agenda work his way toward a conclusion that the evidence demanded regardless of what the complaint had intended. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. When Marsh came back in and sat down and looked at Rowan across the table, she met his eyes and kept her hands still and breathed. Ms. Jenkins, he said, the complaint filed against your license has been reviewed, assessed against the clinical evidence and witness testimony presented, and has been determined to be without merit. He held her gaze. The complaint is dismissed. Your license is not subject to further review on this matter. Your record will reflect no disciplinary action. He paused. On behalf of this board, I want to say clearly that the standard of care you demonstrated in this incident reflects the highest level of clinical judgment and professional courage. The nursing profession benefits from people who trust their training when everything else says stand back. Rowan breathed out. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the kind of breath a body took when it had been held at a certain level of tension for long enough that releasing it was almost involuntary. The breath after the code, When the rhythm came back, the breath after the long shift, when the last patient stabilized the breath of someone who had held their piece of the chain until the next hands were ready and could finally let go. Behind her, Emily made a quiet sound that might have been a breath and might have been something else. Chen put a hand on Rowan's arm for exactly 2 seconds and removed it, which was exactly the right amount of contact. Sterling across the room looked at Rowan. He gave her a single nod. The nod of a man who had told her 3 weeks ago that he would be in front of that committee one way or another, and who had kept his word and who would keep it again when the time came. Rowan Jenkins walked out of that hearing room and into a hallway that was nothing like the East Wing corridor of St. Jude's. No crash carts, no monitors beeping, no one running, and she stood in it for a moment and understood that her life had changed in a way she had not asked for and would not undo. She went back to work 2 days later. The East Wing corridor was exactly as she had left it. Margaret was making terrible coffee in the break room. The monitors in Trauma Bay 3 were beeping at their normal cadences. The hallway had seen everything, and it received her back without ceremony, which was exactly what she needed. She was halfway through her first shift when a charge nurse she didn't know well stopped her near the supply alcove and said, "You're Jenkins, right?" The one who, "I'm Jenkins," Rowan said. "Yes." The charge nurse looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had formed an opinion about a person based on what they'd heard and was currently revising it upward. "Good to have you back," she said. "Good to be back," Rowan said. And she meant it. Not because everything had been resolved, because it hadn't. The investigation into the Trident program would run for months. The senator would fight his way through a process that moved exactly as slowly as Holt had warned, and Blake would hire lawyers and deny and delay, in the manner of men who had resources and experience with being the subject of investigations. None of that was finished. None of that was clean. But Sterling was alive. His testimony was on record. The tox results were in the hands of people who could not be pressured by the same levers that had worked on Yates and the contractors before him. And the woman who had carried a lukewarm cup of coffee down a hospital hallway on a Thursday afternoon and turned a corner at the right moment had her license, her record, and her name intact. Some things you fought because someone asked you to. Some things you fought because the system required it. And some things you fought because you turned a corner and found a man dying, and the choice to act was not really a choice at all. It was just what you did because the job was and the job was to save people, and everything else was noise. Rowan Jenkins had spent 11 years learning the difference between noise and what mattered. She intended to spend the next 11 years doing exactly the same thing.